Hello, I'm Susan Avery, the editor of My Purchasing Center, and I am at the Purchasing Management Association of Boston's monthly meeting. And I'm here with Chris Sawchuk of the Hackett Group, who gave a presentation this evening on the Hackett Group's key issues study, which we've written about in My Purchasing Center. The Hackett Group is a valued partner to My Purchasing Center. So, Chris, you talked about the current environment that procurement is finding itself in as compared to a few years back. Could you describe that for us?
Yeah, certainly. One of the things I talk about is that the environment that we're in today is very similar to what has been, over a number of years. One of the key things is that, there's uncertainty in the environment today. It continues on. I mean, we haven't seen that change. Certainly, I think if you look at a lot of organizations, if you look out there, I mean, there are instances where you're starting to see the volatility come down a bit, which uncertainty really drives that volatility. But the uncertainty remains. There's events that are occurring that continue to create and continue this environment of uncertainty. So it's an environment that we have to live with. And what that uncertainty is actually creating is volatility. Because we don't know necessarily what's going to happen. When we ask organizations, about volatility, and one of the important things is to look at volatility of our input costs. And over the next several years, when we look at our input costs, we ask organizations, what do you think of the volatility over the next year? What they're telling us is, over 20% of the organizations see high volatility over the next year. But more importantly, what I talk about there is that when we ask organizations, where do you think we'll be in 2 years from now? It's actually a higher percentage. So the volatility and the uncertainty that we're experiencing today is not necessarily going to go away over the next several years. We're expecting to see that happen and continue to maintain, over the next several years. Now, the other thing I talk about the current environment is, you can look at it from a couple of different perspectives. One is I like to say if we're going to look at the current environment, it's important to actually look back in time as to what has happened over the last, 5-6 years. And I like to actually compare what occurred, prior to the downturn in 2008, how that environment is becoming very similar to the environment that we are in today. Right? So if you look at the environment from 2005 to 2008, you saw a period of time where we actually saw inflationary pressures within the marketplace, but the impact that it was having on procurement organizations is that the savings that procurement organizations were delivering back to their organizations were actually declining. And was actually forcing procurement to, what I like to say, evolve what they were actually doing, evolve their value to the organization. But right about the time that we were actually thinking about that and thinking about evolving, the market crashed. And we went through that in 2008. So the whole focus on evolving our value proposition to augment this decline in the savings that we were delivering to our organizations actually, changed. Because now, with the deflationary environment, our savings actually went up. And that has occurred for the last number of years, until recently. And what our benchmark numbers are showing now is what we expected to see eventually, and that we're now starting to see a decline in the spend savings and cost avoidances that procurement organizations are delivering back to their organization, back to the same position we were in prior to the downturn when we were looking at that. And it forces us to evolve our value proposition back to the organization. The difference today is the level of uncertainty that exists in the marketplace.
I think you also talked about different changing priorities of the organization and how procurement needs to change. And one of them was becoming more involved in revenue generation. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? Cost, of course, is always going to be important, but can you talk to the revenue generation point?
Absolutely. One of the things that, as you saw when I talked this evening was, there's a number of things. We ask organizations on an annual basis, what are the things that are key and top of mind as we look into the next year? So as we were looking into 2013, organizations came back and they, told us what's top of mind. What are the things that are top of mind? And so one of the things that I showed was the difference between 2012 and 2013. And there's two main things that actually occurred during that period of time. One is that you find that there were more areas selected as key issues for organizations as they focus on things in 2013 than what we saw in 2012. Meaning that if we selected, 3 key issues of primary focus for us in 2012, we're now looking at 4 or 5 as being key issues for organizations in 2013. So we have a lot more on our plate. The other thing is some of the areas that actually changed. So, number one, the focus on spend savings and cost avoidances, like I said earlier tonight, it's been number one for the last 7, 8 years that we've been running the study. Okay, it hasn't changed. The percentage of people that identify as a key issue changes, but it's always been number one. It's the highest percentage of focus for organizations. But right on its heel now is you're finding areas like innovation. Our support and how we enable and support the revenue and top-line growth of our organizations. Now, last year, when our companies and our enterprises were really focused on growth, we as procurement organizations were not necessarily focused on that as much. The focus on innovation and things like that was around 44%. What we saw happen in 2013, it was a huge shift. We saw that jump from 44% to over 70%. So we've gotten much more aligned to what our organizations are focused on. Our organizations are focused on growth and certainly global growth. And with that, we now find that procurement organizations are much more aligned to what our organizations are focused on. They're still focused on improving their operating margins. We got that one. We're focused on, on the cost reductions, but we're now much more aligned to the top line objectives of our organizations in terms of our activity and focus areas in 2013.
It sounds like great news for purchasing and procurement. Another point that you brought up that I think is important and was very interesting was outsourcing. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that procurement, companies are not outsourcing as much of procurement as they are other functions. Can you talk about what that means to procurement and where you see that heading?
Certainly. When we look at outsourcing, and I always like to compare to other functional areas, number one, and say, well, where are we in terms of outsourcing? And, for a number of years, you didn't really see procurement outsourcing to the level that we see in other functional areas. Certainly in IT, you see a significant, amount of outsourcing, finance, HR, et cetera. And when you looked at procurement, you saw a level of outsourcing that was fairly nascent. It was fairly small in terms of percentage-wise of the overall cost of that function. One of the things that we like to look at is, the component in terms of where are our costs, as a function. And certainly some of the costs that we have within our function is labor costs, right? The people that we have actually conducting the activities within sourcing and procurement, whether it's in finance or IT or HR, et cetera. But we also look at outsourcing. Outsourcing is a component of the cost if we happen to have a third party perform some of that activity for us. And in procurement, that percentage that was allocated to outsourcing has been relatively small. And, if you look at that and say, well, what has changed? Because one of the things in our most recent survey shows that over the next several years, the expectation is that more procurement organizations will be allocating and outsourcing a higher percentage of their activity to a third party. Anywhere from 10 to 30% to maybe even 40% of their activity will be done by a third party. Now, as you ask those organizations, what type of activity will that be? Certainly the transactional activity is one of those activities. Indirect spend is another area of focus, especially the areas that they don't necessarily create competitive differentiation in their organizations or between other companies, is a great opportunity to look to a third party to take over some of the activity. But the other is building new capabilities, activities that you may not have in your organization today. And the example I talked about earlier was around supply market intelligence. Maybe an activity that we may not have a capability today, so we have the ability to either decide that we want to build that capability ourselves organically, or we can go get that activity through a third-party relationship. And so we're seeing some of that growth. And certainly over the next several years, we do see that growing. And certainly that's the feedback we got from a number of organizations that they expect to see that happen. And roughly over the next several years, I think it was like something like 30% of the organizations expect to have that level of outsourcing within the next 2 years.
Great. Thank you, Chris Sawchuk of the Hackett Group, for sharing your expertise and insight with my purchasing center.
Quite welcome.